Villains are an integral part of the stories we tell. They're symbols of power and weakness, control and chaos. They can be witty and likable, or cold and mysterious. But how does one write a villain that readers love to hate? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Emma with Servicescape, and welcome back to Write On. Today we're going to talk about a few ways you can start writing villains of your own. To do that, we first need to examine the characters within your plot, the archetypes they fill, and how those archetypes function within your story. First, let's talk about the protagonist. They're the character that moves the story along by attempting to achieve some sort of goal. An antagonist, on the other hand, is the character that gets in the way of the protagonist achieving that goal. And while it may seem that the protagonist and antagonist are representations of good and evil respectively, it's not always so black and white. A protagonist doesn't have to be fully morally good to move the story forward, nor does an antagonist have to be completely evil to prevent the story from advancing. Your protagonist, for example, could be an anti-hero, which is a subverted version of the classic hero trope. A classic hero is exactly what you'd think: strong, brave, merciful, and selfless in the face of danger. An anti-hero, on the other hand, may have some of those traits, but probably not all of them, and definitely a few negative ones. They can be criminals, narcissists, cowards, and misanthropes. Despite this, they're often driven by, or eventually toward, good intention. And I think I have the perfect way to demonstrate this, so just give me a second. Think of Han Solo from Star Wars, the self-involved smuggler turned rebel ally, or Robin Hood, who steals from the rich to give to the poor. Even Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol is an anti-hero, as he redeems himself after realizing what a horrible person he's been. Your antagonist, on the other hand, can be a villain, but doesn't always have to be. Think of a detective pursuing a criminal protagonist, or a parent preventing their child from doing something they think will put them in danger. Antagonists can operate with good intentions despite hindering story progression. And on that note, the antagonist doesn't necessarily even need to be human.
I'm sorry, Dave.
Or sentient. Your story's antagonist can be an animal, an object, an ideology, etc. Think of the shark from Jaws or the iceberg from Titanic. These two things don't act with evil intention, or any intention, but they still prevent the protagonist from reaching their goal. Though if your antagonist shark somehow learns to speak and vows to take over the world, or your iceberg suddenly becomes sentient and actively seeks out ships just to sink them, you most definitely have a villain on your hands. Which brings us to our main question: what makes a villain? For the most part, a villain should be inherently evil, their main goal morally wrong or unacceptable. But this doesn't mean that they shouldn't have depth. They can have traits, flaws, a tragic backstory that made them the way they are, and a moral code that they follow. Details like this can add to their overall appeal. You can even write an anti-villain, one who has heroic traits and ideals, but ends up being the antagonist. Your villain could have a set of morals that make it difficult for them to actually pull the trigger when it comes time, like in the Harry Potter series with Draco Malfoy and his inability to kill Dumbledore. They could start out not wanting to be evil, but ending up evil because of the circumstances around them, like Carrie White from Stephen King's Carrie, who snaps after being harshly bullied and abused. They could be an extremist that believes in a goal that they believe is good, but don't shy away from evil when it comes to achieving it, like Carrie's religious mother, who genuinely believes her punishment of her daughter is justified in the eyes of her God. There are a lot of options, and while many of these roles can overlap with villainy, those ones in particular are for another day. Today we're going to focus on pure villainy, the characters motivated solely by evil desires, and what exactly makes them tick. To start off, let's talk about your villain's appearance. In many pieces of media, creators have relied on making their villain look obviously evil, from eye patches to curly mustaches, scars, and other physical detriments. And while that's a recognizable way to categorize someone as evil, it can also lead to the use of harmful and overused stereotypes or tropes. So while there are ways to make your villain physically unpleasant to emphasize your point, it may be worth it to explore other options that can benefit your story. There can be just as much power in making a villain beautiful as there is in making a villain unattractive. You could juxtapose a villain's cruelty with beauty, a kind face or demeanor, making it more of a shock when they commit atrocities against their fellow man. You could even make them look relatively plain, easily able to blend into a crowd at their advantage. Just remember that in the end, your villain's capacity for evil should be emphasized by their actions rather than relying on their appearance. Speaking of that, let's figure out what your villain's goal is. You may know that you want your villain to take over the world, but knowing why they want to take over the world is important. They could be motivated by revenge, justice, money, or a need for acceptance gone wrong. They could be motivated by fear, or even because they believe that they're destined to have power through birthright or prophecy. They can even be motivated for more positive reasons like romance, or even because they think that what they're doing benefits the greater good, despite a majority of people disagreeing. Good or bad intentions aside, your villain's goal should be generally unacceptable in the eyes of whatever society they're a part of. And in reality, it should really only benefit them specifically, or sometimes a smaller group of their followers. With your villain's goals in place, it's time to work on some of the details, specifically their backstory. Ask yourself, what made your villain evil? Was it a particular event or person? Or did their environment or other circumstances make them this way? Were they an orphan, resentful of their parents' abandonment? Was someone or something taken away from them in a way that changed them forever? After you decide, it's important to remember that even though a villain's backstory may be tragic, their pain or experiences do not have to lessen their level of cruelty. And if anything, it can make it more intense. And though it may be tempting to give every villain a tragic backstory, it's important to remember that not every villain needs one to be evil. Think of Disney's 1959 version of Sleeping Beauty, before all the live-action films that filled in the history. Maleficent cursed baby Aurora simply because she wasn't invited to a party, which is a whole new level of petty, and she still played the role of villain just fine without us knowing much else about her. With the backstory worked out, it's time to define more of the boundaries of your villain's personality. Ask yourself, does your villain know that they're the villain? Do they believe that they're right? If they do, this will only further their drive for power, and in return can make things harder for the hero or the protagonist. From there, ask yourself, does your villain feel wronged in some way? If so, how and by who? Maybe they feel they've been wronged by the protagonist or a family member. They could even feel wronged on a larger scale by an ideology or society as a whole. This ties into their motivation. Ask yourself why they do the things they do. More likely than not, there's a reason in their past for their current actions, even if it's not morally justifiable in the eyes of the public. Like we mentioned before, they could act based on how they were treated by others, or act based on their own sense of justice. They could be an extremist thinking they're doing the right thing, or acting on a personal bias. They could be in danger themselves or trying to repay some sort of debt. Whatever the motivation, ensure that it's credible by tying in pieces of their history and personality to it, and this in turn will inform you how far your villain will go to achieve their goal. Think of Lord Voldemort from the Harry Potter series. He's motivated by power, cruelty, and genetic royalty due to hatred of his own parentage. Or JD from the film Heathers, who's motivated by the way teenagers are seen, treated, and expected to act in society. Neither of them is justified in a moral sense, but they still have a motivation that moves their story forward, and therefore establishes the believability of their characters. From there, you can then work on the day-to-day details of their evil doing. Ask yourself, does your villain have support, such as henchmen or followers? If so, how are they treated? Are they treated as equals? Are they seen as subordinate? Are they just goofy sidekicks that are there to be turned into marketable plushies? The overarching question to answer here is, how does the villain in your story treat others? Defining the way they interact with others will help to establish their power dynamic in both private and public spheres, and make it easy for you to write them into your story. Do they rule with fear? Do they rule with promise? Both? It's up to you. Next, let's talk about how your villain creates drama or suspense. This can be done through exploring their interactions with not only the protagonist, but the general public. Do they actively pursue victims, or do they wait for victims to come to them? Are their attacks so frequent or feared that the mere mention of their name is forbidden? Or are they more of an underground threat known only to a select few? Both of these scenarios create stress or fear for the protagonist to deal with in different ways. For instance, a villain who poses a more public threat can be dealt with on a larger scale, characters coming together to fight off some sort of war, whereas a villain who works on a smaller scale could inflict more personal damage, leaving the protagonist to deal with them on their own or making them a target. You can also mix the two. Think of this as a spectrum of danger that impacts your plot. The more people your villain affects, the more widespread the issue. The fewer people they affect, the less widespread the issue, but this doesn't make them any less dangerous to the protagonist. Now it's time to define the relationship that your protagonist and your villain have. Ask yourself what your villain thinks of your protagonist and vice versa. It's most likely going to be a negative, unless you're going for some sort of enemies to lovers trope. Do they see your protagonist as a threat or an obstacle? Are they fearful of some sort of quality or object that they possess? Do they see them as a challenge or as some sort of pawn? Similar questions can be asked of your protagonist. Are they frightened of the villain or just wary of them? Overall, you should aim to ask, what does the villain have that the protagonist doesn't? Conversely, what does the protagonist have that the villain doesn't? This is where you describe the root of their conflict and once again give reason behind their actions and emotions. The final question to ask yourself when developing a villain is this: after all is said and done, do they change? Typically, a protagonist will grow from their experiences over the course of your story, adjusting the way they react to internal and external issues for better or for worse. Whether or not your villain experiences the same thing is up to you. They could very well come out of the story a changed person, one who's seen the error of their ways and wishes to do things differently, but they certainly don't have to. And while a redemption arc is an interesting way to flesh out your villain, some argue that it's overdone or unnecessary. And it's important to remember that your villain doesn't have to be redeemed if it suits them and your story. In fact, they could very well come out worse than they were before, leading to future conflict. A strong, unwavering villain can be used to emphasize both bad and good qualities within your protagonist and make for a strong dynamic in your story. The villain can appeal to the protagonist's weakness or temptations, and therefore can be a reminder of the protagonist's strength to resist them. In the end, it's up to you to decide how deeply these two characters affect each other. And it's a balance that can be changed depending on what you think your story needs. There are many ways to write a villain that people love to hate or just love in general. And most of these villains are built on strong foundations, often with very human stories behind them. After all, strong villains come from the darker parts of ourselves that aren't always addressed, and creating a character made of those parts resonates with the human experience, even if you don't want it to. That being said, with a little organization, a couple of questions, and a bit of evil, you too can write a villain ready to take over the world. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like and check out the channel. We've got some pretty cool topics on the horizon, and we'd love for you to stick around. Also, be sure to follow our Twitter page. We post something new almost every day and would love to have you be a part of the community there as well. See you next time.